All right. Good evening, everyone. Turn to the neighbor to your left of you and say, "You're looking good tonight." And then to the right, because you don't want anybody to get left out. Well, welcome to Reparations Now. And we've got some awesome people on the panel. This is brought to you by the Black Jewish Justice Alliance, a collaboration between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, CLU, ICAR, Bend the Arc, and so many other awesome organizations. And if I didn't call your organization, you can call it out. All right? And who? NAACP and everything else. I don't know who Reverend Eddie is representing today. So I am not the MC. They just asked me to welcome you guys. So welcome, and I'm going to sit down because I want to see hear what folks got to say. Amen. All right. Ashe. Amin.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carmen Smart, and I am speaking on behalf of my father, Pastor William D. Smart, one of the founders of the Black and Jewish Alliance and the president and CEO of SCLC of Southern California. As a part of Mayor Bass's transition team, he was called in last minute tonight to attend the mayor's very first State of the Union. But today we are here to discuss the reparations movement. Some may say, why do we want reparations? Others might add that slavery was so long ago. Well, we live in a country where some of the richest people and the biggest corporations are built off of the backs of free labor, torture, brutality, and the dehumanization of our slave ancestors. This money gets funneled into the very systems that fund capitalism and colonization, the systems that keep our people disenfranchised, marginalized, and targeted. In a country where, I don't have my glasses on. In a country where our social systems is governed by capitalism, economic security is congruent with our mental, physical, spiritual, and social well-being. Reparations is not just about receiving a check from the government. It is the acknowledgement and validation of the years of trauma that changed the trajectory of Black people all across the world. There is no amount of money that can replace the years of struggle, displacement, colonization, and trauma that we have endured. Yet, so many Black people in America and in our indigenous homelands across the world continue to be drained of our resources, labor, and life force energy. When will come a time that we demand retribution for the raping of our culture that we have been victim to for years? Tonight, we will hear from some dynamic community specialists who will break down the importance of the reparations movement and why now more than ever, this is an important fight. The Black and Jewish Justice Alliance works hard to exemplify the importance of a unified front in battling America's malicious systems that continuously oppress our people. We want to welcome you, and we pray and hope you leave today feeling motivated and prepared to continue our fight for justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So I want to welcome you here to this space. My name is Brooke Werchafter. I'm the Director of Community Organizing here at ICAR, and this is ICAR's event space, and we are so delighted to have all of you here with us this evening for this important conversation. Rabbi Brous, who is our senior rabbi and founder and fearless leader, asked me specifically to let you all know how much she how much she values these kinds of conversations, how this is exactly the kind of gathering and conversation she envisioned when we bought this space, when we planned for the building that we're going to build here. We are working right now to raise the money to build what will be our future home on this property. It will be a community center. It will be a meeting place. We hope for all of Los Angeles to come together to have conversations just like this one about what we need to do to build the kind of society that we all want to live in together. To build a city, a county, a state, a nation, a world of love and justice and respect for one another, where people live in dignity and with abundance that we know this earth provides for us all. And so she is so glad that we are here having this conversation tonight, and so sorry that she can't be here with us. She had another commitment that she also was unable to get out of this evening, but is glad to have you all here and welcomes you all to this space. So on behalf of Rabbi Brous, on behalf of our community, I too would like to welcome you here to ICAR, and we're so glad to have you all here. I want to take a minute to introduce our panelists, and then we'll begin. The way it's going to work is I'm going to moderate. I have some questions that I have prepared, which I hope will help us all better understand what the Commission's report was about, and then we can have a deeper dialogue about faith communities and how we as communities of faith can help support the work of the Commission in bringing about the situation in which California will actually begin to make reparation and restitution for all the harm that has been done and that continues to be done to Black communities still in this state and in this country. And so with that, let me begin by introducing our panelists. So first, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Cheryl Grills. Dr. Grills is a clinical psychologist and currently with an emphasis in community psychology. She's a professor in the psychology department at Loyola Marymount University and has been for 34 years. And also the director of its Psychology Applied Research Center. She's also a national past president of the Association of Black Psychologists and a founder of the Imoyase, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Community Support, did I? No? How is it pronounced? Help me.
It's Imoyase.
Thank you. Imoyase, Community Support Service, a 30-year nonprofit organization providing action research, program evaluation, and strategic technical assistance to social justice and social service community-based organizations. Dr. Grills also has lots of experience serving on public commissions and boards. Currently, she serves as the commissioner and vice chair of the Los Angeles County Civil Brand Commission, which addresses the conditions and practices within the LA County adult jails. A really, really important work, and one that we all need to pay more attention to, because our jails are a travesty of justice, as folks in this room, I think, really know. So thank you for that work. Dr. Grills is here tonight in her capacity, having served on the state's Commission on Reparations. This is a commission that was created by the legislature by a bill that was passed a couple of years ago now, and they have worked together over the last several years to write a report which really studies the entire history of enslavement, of racial injustice in this country, and the ongoing racial oppression and how that oppression continues to be systematized across all of our systems: economic, social, educational, health, and social welfare, and to make a series of proposals about how we as a state can begin to address and redress those harms. And so it's in that capacity that we have invited her and are so glad that she's joining us here this evening. We also have, thank you. Welcome. We also are pleased to have Rabbi Dr. Aryeh Cohen. Rabbi Cohen teaches at the Ziegler School for Rabbinical Studies, and had for many years was the rabbi in residence at Ben the Ark, which is a Jewish organization that works for justice here in Los Angeles and across the country. Thank you, Dr. Cohen. And also, we have Reverend Eddie Anderson. Reverend Anderson is the pastor at McCarty Memorial Church, also an organizer with LA Voice, and a longtime activist in the city of Los Angeles. He served on, most recently on the city's commission, on the redistricting commission, which you might have heard a little bit about last year, and does lots of important work in the city for racial justice and economic justice and for repair. And so thank you, Reverend Anderson, also a dear friend. Thank you for being here with us. All right. Let me turn to my questions. So, Dr. Gross, I really want to begin with you. Can you please just describe to us, for those who don't really know it well, the work of the commission, how it was created, who serves on the panel, and what the scope of the work you were asked to do was? Yes, please turn it on.
Okay.
It's on.
It's on, okay. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.
And hold it real close.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, hold it real close.
I have to put it real close. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here this evening on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's a labor of love, but it's also a very painful journey. The California Reparations Task Force was established by Assembly Bill 3121. And that was in September of 2020. And we have a 2-year appointment. So we will actually be sunsetting June 30th, 2023. There are 9 members of the task force. 5 of us were appointed by the governor. I'm one of the governor appointees. 2 were appointed, thank you. 2 were appointed by the Senate Pro Tem and 2 appointed by the Speaker. We have, our charge is pretty straightforward, yet it's complicated. Straightforward in the sense that we are, yeah, okay. I really have to hold it up close, okay. So we are charged with summarizing racism and discrimination against African Americans in the past and in the present, both by private, legal, and public sectors. Secondly, we are to propose forms of reparations to address the multiple harms that occurred from enslavement through to the present. See, some people get this misunderstanding that this is only about reparations for enslavement. Unfortunately, just because we got the Emancipation Proclamation, freedom did not come to us. Third, we are supposed to educate the public about reparations, and then finally craft an apology for the state. Now, we've accomplished quite a bit in this short period of time we've been operating as a task force. We completed and disseminated an interim report about a year ago. And in that interim report, it's about 500 pages long, nice, easy bedtime reading. But it could give you nightmares because of some of the content. But it probably is one of the most comprehensive descriptions of the truth of enslavement and the brutality of it, the cruelty of it, how heinous it was, the scope and scale of it, but it also, this report carries a through line to the present. I have a saying that I use now because of the work of this interim report, which is, for Black folk, our past is our present. People often will say, Black folk, why don't you all get over it? That was so long ago. And my response is really quite simple. I'll get over it as soon as I get out of it. And we're just not out yet. In almost every almost every sector of life, every institution in this country weighs heavily on the quality of life of Black folk. Every indicator of quality of life and quote unquote success and being able to move closer and closer to the American dream is in fact not the case for African Americans. We are, as Tom Burrell said, at the bottom of every good list and the top of every bad list. And in that context, we see problems in education that we report on in the interim report, in housing, in healthcare, in transportation, in environmental factors, in the wealth gap, et cetera. But I think the thing that really troubles my heart the most, and we touch on it in the report, is the impact that past and present racism is having on the quality of life, but the very life, physically and in terms of emotional and mental health, on Black Americans. A lot of people don't know that, and this is before COVID, there was a special thing commissioned, and I'm sounding like the professor, so I'm going to wrap this up. There was a special committee formed by Congress focused on child suicide, but not just child suicide in general. It was focused on the reality and the finding in the data that while suicide rates for all racial groups in terms of children was on the decline, it was on the rise for Black children. And I'm not talking like teenagers. We're talking about kids 8, 9, 10, 12 years old killing themselves, and especially young boys hanging themselves. And the irony does not escape me that our children are taking their own lives using the same method that was used to take the lives of their ancestors. And so there's an awful lot of work that we need to do to address those wrongs. The report has been very well received. There have been very few challenges to it, if any, perhaps Fox News. I take that as a plus. We will be issuing a final report June 30th, and that report will be aligned with the interim report. So the interim report has 13 chapters. The first chapter is an introduction. The subsequent 12 chapters, each chapter has a detailed discussion of harm in a particular area. For example, health and mental health, racial terror is a chapter, pathologizing the Black family, the wealth gap, et cetera. So the final report will pick up where that interim report left off, and we'll talk about forms of reparations for each of those categories of harm.
Thank you. And we're going to talk more at the end about what people can do and about the specific recommendations in the report. I want to ask another broad question now, which is, there's a widely held perception that California is a very progressive state, and that it was never a slave state, and it did not support enslavement. So can you speak to what you found in the study that you did about our state's relationship as a state to enslavement and to the decades, the years of racial injustice that have come since then, and to reparations as a consequence of that history?
It was so much there. I had to bring my notes on that one. We have such a, the United States loves illusions. It really does. I mean, it's as though we don't trust ourselves to deal with the truth and to be able to reckon with the truth. Well, California is one of those illusions. California presents itself as this incredibly progressive state that is all inclusive. We probably defined diversity, equity, and inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I'm sorry, but I have to burst that bubble. So yes, people actually think that California is not well suited to address the issue. But let me just give you a couple of examples about why California is the perfect place to address reparations. Even though and I'm just going to give you a handful, and I actually, as I was preparing for this, I had like 5 pages of just examples. So I'm just going to cherry pick a couple of them for you. So even though California was a free state when it entered the Union, California ignored its own status as a free state and allowed Black people brought to California by enslavers to be enslaved in this state. California maintained and colluded with a system of enslavement and subjugation by using the belief system of white supremacy to restrict the freedom of Black Americans. The state had laws, court decisions, and government policies and practices that reinforced discrimination against Black folk. California contributed to the wealth gap that persists today between Black and white Americans at all income levels. California illegally ignored Black families' land deeds and literally took them away from them. I was in Palm Springs yesterday for a reparations community meeting and the residents, the descendants and survivors of an area called Section 14 are seeking reparations for what the city of Palm Springs did to them. The mayor, along with the fire department, went to this part of town called Section 14, which was populated by African American, Latinx, and Native American families, and essentially told them, get out now. And when they said now, they meant like right that moment or the next day. And then they came back through and bulldozed or burned down their homes. And there was no compensation for what was done. There was no litigation about what was done, et cetera, et cetera.
And how recently was that?
That was in the 1920s, right? And then other examples for California, and then I'll stop. 500 to 600 enslaved African Americans lived and worked in California during the gold rush. It's been estimated that 1,500 enslaved African Americans lived in California in 1852. More than 75% of the enslaved people trafficked to California were younger men or teenaged boys who were forced to work in the gold mines. One thing that California did, and I'm going to give you two last examples, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, it did not apply to most cases in California, but California ignored that reality and actually punished people who were considered to be runaways. The California government's most pro-slavery action, though, was passing and enforcing a state fugitive slave law in 1852. That legislative decision to pass that fugitive slave law made California a more pro-slavery state than most other free states. So we were worse than other states. And it allowed enslavers to use violence to capture enslaved people, and it required state officials to help enslavers capture and arrest enslaved people. And then if you were arrested, you could not testify if you were African American on your own behalf, and not a free black person was allowed to testify on your behalf either. But here's something that I think a lot of people don't realize about California. Oh, by the way, California ignored the 14th Amendment, never considered it. The legislature voted to reject ratifying the 15th Amendment in 1870. It wasn't until 1959 and 1962, respectively, that California passed the 14th and 15th Amendments. Now, that's just like astounding to me. But the last thing I said last thing a few times now. This is the real last one. The last. This most people aren't aware of, and I think this is something we really need to be worried about, because I don't think it's fully gone away. It's kind of baked into the ether, into the ethos of communities across the state. LA was the epicenter of Ku Klux Klan activity in California. Now, there were several KKK branches in LA, Santa Monica, Huntington Park, Redondo Beach, Hermosa Beach, Long Beach, Glendale, San Pedro, Anaheim, Fresno, Kern County, San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. By the 20s, the LAPD was a den of corruption that was infiltrated with KKK members who did all kinds of retaliatory policing on the black community. The KKK infiltrated all levels of state and local government. There were 3,000 KKK members in LA County, over 1,000 in the city limits, and 3 KKK members on the DA's own staff. But, in Brea, that's the one that astounds me. The five of the town's 8 mayors were Klansmen, as were 6 of the 10 councilmen who sat on the board of trustees, half of the city's treasurers, half of the city's engineers, half of its city clerks and its city marshals, and 2/3 of its fire chiefs were KKK members. And Kern County was considered the most brutal example of KKK activity anywhere.
Yes, and continues to be. I mean, right, Kern County continues to be a place where black people have good reason to fear deeply for how they will be treated in our justice system. There's just a recent documentary out about that. So Dr. Gross, can you tell us more about what reparations means? I think people have some misconceptions and maybe limited understandings about it.
So yeah, when people hear reparations, they immediately jump to this idea about cash. Give me my money. Where's my check? That is so not the full scale or scope of reparations. And so I'm going to, because I am the professor, I'm going to just read you what I wrote as my definition that tries to at least incorporate, I think, many of the principles that we are required to address. So reparations are responses, programmatic, financial, and healing, that are justified on the basis of past harm, the legacy of those harms, and continued current harms. These responses should be designed to assess and correct the harms in their multiple forms: material, psychological, emotional, societal, and improve the lives of victims into the future. I say into perpetuity. This definition is quite broad, and that's intentional, and it makes room for a diverse set of responses. This process must include reversing harmful racial narratives, in part achieved by truth-telling, which is what the interim report was about, also achieved by policies and structures established to create and perpetuate exploitation and racial hierarchies. And reparations must ensure that it will not happen again, right? And so this truth-telling and this change process has to be top-down, bottom-up, and inside-out. And it must recognize that reparations in the United States is not, at least in California rather, is not merely a local issue. It is a global issue, but our federal government has been derelict in its duty, so California is picking up the slack. At the end of the day, it is important to know that the task force must abide by the United Nations guidelines for reparations. And there are 5 of those guidelines. One is there needs to be satisfaction. There's an acknowledgement and an apology. Secondly, there needs to be compensation. Third, there needs to be restitution and repatriation, if that's feasible. That's action to restore. We don't know what it would look like to restore Black folk to whole and healthy in this country, because we never were whole and healthy in this country. And then fourth, guarantees of non-repetition. So we have to make sure that things are done so that it is almost impossible, at least legally, to replicate some of the past harms. And then finally, the 5th criteria is rehabilitation: legal, medical, psychological, and other care and services. Reparations really does need to include healing, and it's not just healing for Black folk. We all need healing. We have all been infected by the disease of racism. And at the end of the day, reparations is not a Black issue, it's an American issue.
Did the commission study who should be eligible for reparations? And should it be limited to those who were descendants of the people who were enslaved, or should it include others who've suffered from ongoing systemic racial injustice and inequality?
So this was one of the most difficult moments in the task force for me. We had a narrowly won decision, 5-4. 5 in favor of lineage-based or descendant-only reparations, and 4 of us voted against that. And we said, if you are Black in this country, if you are Black in this state, and the police pull you over, and they're in a bad mood that day, and they're looking for some way to expel, just get rid of that energy, they're not going to say, now, before I start beating on you, are you a direct descendant or were you an immigrant from like Nigeria or somewhere? They're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. And when it was time for Section 14 to be demolished, they didn't say only the direct descendants' houses, right? When they did the redlining, they didn't say only direct descendants' homes, right? When there was discrimination in employment and education disparities, that affected all Black people. So at this point, the vote was in favor of, but here's the interesting rub on that. Only one recommendation truly could be dispensed based on lineage, and that's the cash payment. And I'm actually okay with that if that's going to direct descendants, because that's payment, let's say, for unpaid labor from enslavement and post-Reconstruction, right? All the rest of the recommendations are policy and structural change, educating the public and things of that nature. You can't say just direct dependence. In fact, some of the recommendations will benefit everybody, right? For example, one of our recommendations is to abolish the death penalty. I am not willing to put my name on anything that says abolish it only for black people who are direct descendants. No, that's just wrong. So there are many problems with it, and we haven't yet figured out how one actually determines if you are a direct descendant, because that means you have to show the family lineage. Well, the records weren't kept consistently or evenly. Not everybody has the time or the energy to kind of go do that. Even if they provide genealogists who will help, it still takes a lot of your time. And then we're going to re-traumatize the traumatized. When I started digging and delving in mine, I found 4 family members who were lynched. I found that my grandfather and uncles were probably on the run, which is why their records stop before the time period that is necessary for me to prove my own lineage, at least on my mother's side. And then what do we do with our most vulnerable? Children in the child welfare system who can't necessarily figure out their lineage. So we're going to exclude them? I think not. So we've got a lot of things still to deal with, and we'll see what happens with the lineage-based.
Yeah. So I have one more question just for you, and then I'm going to bring in our faith leaders. I apologize to you both. But thank you. You're teaching us all, and we're really grateful for the education. So did the commission consider whether the state should study reparations for other groups who have been displaced or actively discriminated against by state policy based on their race or ethnicity? And here, obviously, thinking of Native Americans, Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, and others.
No, the Assembly bill specifically talks about African Americans with special consideration for direct descendants. That being said, I think that California has harmed a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and everyone deserves their moment of retribution. Oh, not retribution, but their moment. My Freudian slip. Right. Everyone deserves their moment for reparations, for redress, for truth-telling, for atonement. And I don't think we want to kind of dilute the focus. There should be one, and there is one in various forms for Native Americans. There's activity that has happened and has been happening. We already know about at the federal level for Japanese Americans, but not necessarily anything that happens specific for California. The Latinx community and the Asian American community have had atrocious things done to them in California that need to be addressed. And so I think we have to be very careful to not get into the reparations Olympics and whose pain and whose suffering was more than the other. Any suffering and any pain is not acceptable, and we all have a responsibility to right the wrongs for everyone. But let's do them one, in their turn, and let the focus be where the focus needs to be for any particular group.
Yeah. So, thank you, and I'll give you a moment to take a breath here. We really appreciate all we're learning tonight. This event is being put on by the Black Jewish Justice Alliance, as of course you all know, and so I want to ask Rabbi Cohen, what is the Jewish community's connection to this work? What is our responsibility, and how do you, as a Jewish leader and teacher, think about our obligation to address the issue of reparations?
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Grills, for coming here, and thank you, Pastor Eddie and Brooke and Ikar and everybody's here. But really, thank you, Dr. Grills, for educating us, for really teaching us. And I, in truth, I just want to let all that sit for a while. I mean, when I read the report, it was, as you said, devastating and enlightening. And then the question is, so most American Jews in the United States today weren't here during the period of enslavement. Not all, and there were there were Jews who were enslavers. There were both Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, both Jews from Europe and Jews from Spain. Some Jews were involved in the slave trade, Jews in the islands who owned sugar plantations. But most Jews now, especially because of the waves of immigration in the early 20th century and the mid 20th century, were not here during enslavement. And so the question is, what is generational responsibility? And that's really the question. And I think the Jewish tradition is very clear, actually, that there is responsibility. Jews, as Dr. Grills pointed out, and everybody who lives in California today both benefits from the California economy, which was built with the help of kidnapped labor and stolen labor, and also we are the heirs of the state and the judicial system, the court system, the carceral system, which enforced enslavement. And so in that sense, there's a responsibility that we are part of this state. And so there's a responsibility on many levels that Dr. Grills talked about, both acknowledging fault, acknowledging harm, apology, and restitution. But also there's a principle which comes out in Jewish law, comes from a biblical story of King Achav, or Ahab, who decided that he wanted his neighbor's vineyard, Kerem Navot. His neighbor's name was Naboth, or Navot, and his neighbor didn't want to give him his vineyard. So Achav's wife cooked up this plan where they would accuse Navot of blasphemy, and then they would kill him because he was a blasphemer. And then Achav would come in and just, nobody was living on the land anymore, so it was empty. So he'd just come in and take it over. God wasn't so happy. And so God sent Elijah the prophet to Achav, and he said the following sentence: "Will you murder and also inherit?" Hayarashta v'gam haratzachta v'gam yarashta. It's much more poetic in Hebrew. But in English, the force of it is the same, do you think you can commit a crime and then benefit from the crime even though you've covered up the crime? And this has become a central principle, one of the principles of Jewish law, and it played out in practice. For example, the Talmud says, what happens if a community builds a synagogue, but one of the beams in the synagogue was stolen? And the answer is that by law, you have to destroy the building and give the beam back to the owner. Now, ultimately, they say you can work another way out so that people will repent so that you can pay the owner. But if the owner is insistent, the owner has a right to that beam. And so the principle is, if a crime was committed and the fruit of that crime goes on for generations, it is still criminal. It is still tainted, and you can't whitewash that crime, even though that's kind of an American pastime, and that's how robber barons become the people that fund our culture and remembered as great people. But so Jews benefited, as other people, not any more or less than any other people, but Jews benefited from the crimes in this state, the stolen labor, the enslavement, and so therefore we have an obligation to repay that. And that's not a long time ago. That's, we're talking about, you mentioned Section 14, but also Bruce's Beach, which just was given back now, and it's like, and that was, I don't remember when that was taken away, but it was also the 30s or 40s, and that followed a pattern of black family making good and doing well, and so white folks being jealous, just like, Ahab and Naboth, and taken away. And so and this neighborhood, right around this neighborhood, there are covenant communities where if you look in the deeds of your house, and our house also, for like generation back, says you're not allowed to sell this house. If you buy this house, you agree not to sell it to black people or to Jews. So there's something of an overlap, but so this is not so long ago. This is very recent that we have benefited from this racial hierarchy and the after effects of enslavement and the economic benefits, as it were, of enslavement.
And Reverend Eddie, I want to bring you into the conversation too. As both a pastor, a teacher of Christianity, and as an African American and a leader in that community, how do you think about reparations and the obligation of the society at large to pay them, and what your faith tradition teaches about the process of repair and reparation?
For me, reparations is very personal, and I think my faith calls us to do it as well. I'm originally from Georgia. My ancestors are, not ancestors, my aunts and uncles are Geechee Gullah. And so it was not lost, and it was told to us from a very young age. When people say 40 acres and a mule, that comes from pastors who would ask, what do you want? Slavery, that's what they were saying. They're saying they want the right to own their own land. And so land is very important in my family. So my grandfather, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a rice slave. He was enslaved in Riceboro, Georgia, and they were rice farmers. And so they never got any reparations, any money for that. They lived in we still own the house that they got when they were free. It has 4 whales in front of it, and that's where we go, our ancestral home. And so our faith tells us that there is, God is a God of the oppressed. And that when God liberates you, God does not liberate you and then tell you, figure out how the rest of it works. That when God liberates you, a Jewish term, I guess, is Jubilee happens. Right, that you are fully restored, and that the things that were done wrong to you are wiped away, and that you have a new life, a second chance. That's why when you go to a church, we just celebrated Easter, we talk about crucifixion, but everybody talks about resurrection because you believe there is a second chance. And so our faith tells us that there is a time of repair, and that God favors those who have been not only oppressed, but those who have been enslaved in a very real sense. And growing up, it was very much understood that we didn't get any money. We didn't get any money from sharecropping. We didn't get any money from slavery, from rice farming. This is the Southern come out of me. The white folks who lived in South Georgia did not know how to rice farm, but rice was king. There was cotton and rice, right? They learned that from West African folks who knew how to do rice farming. We get no money from that. We get no money for sharecropping. When you go, my dad, he never went to school with any white people. He wasn't allowed to. And so he didn't go to college, right? And when we went to college, he didn't know how you were supposed to pay for college, right? And so what you get is, talking about education, you get a lot of black folks who are taking out loans and trying to figure out how to make it through, and then realize when they get out, they don't have enough money to buy the house they want to live in. When I came to Los Angeles, my church was one of the first churches to do integration. And so I have people in my congregation who moved here in the 50s, 1953, 1952, 1955, and they very much will tell you, Pastor, on Adams Boulevard, you saw the Klan walk down the street. They would not let us move into these houses in this own neighborhood that we went to church in. And we had to file injunctions in order to do that. They would say, I had one woman in my congregation who, she's Creole, and she said, my grandfather was white. He wasn't allowed to visit us past Wilshire Boulevard. This is Los Angeles today. And so I think our faith tells us that we serve a God who wants you to be whole. And wholeness looks like, yeah, compensation, but it looks like education, it looks like mental health, it looks like being able to have dignity, and to walk through the streets and knowing that you can build something for you. It's a shame the state of Black Los Angeles just came out, and it said that Black folks in Los Angeles County have a 12-year shorter life expectancy than anyone else in the county. What does that mean? That means that Black folks, in a very real sense, are working, investing, putting money away for Social Security, and they never get to benefit from it. That's what it looks like. Right? And so that's, reparations means wholeness. Like, you need health care, you need to be able to have a time off. And so our faith says that God cares and that God demands justice and repair so that we can actually have the, I call it, kingdom of God, which means we are related to one another.
Dr. Grills, listening to both the rabbi and the pastor speak, I think we're hearing a vision of what a better world, a world of repair might look like. I think this might be a good moment to ask you to say more about the specific recommendations in the report for repair well beyond individual payment of reparation. Can you share with us the different categories and just maybe a few examples, because there are so many in the report, about what is this world we would be creating if we actually followed these recommendations?
Wow. So the final report that will include the recommendations will probably add another 500 pages. Because for each of the recommendations, we don't just throw stuff out there. We actually do the legwork, and we vet the information, and we document everything, and then we have consulted with scores of experts. So at the end of the day, for each, as I mentioned before, for each of those 12 chapters, there are at least anywhere from 5 to 20 recommendations to address that harm. So, for example, in the education arena, there are recommendations related to equity in the distribution of funds for different schools, right? Right now, your zip code can determine how much resources your school can get. And so de facto, for the communities that have less income, they're going to get less resources. The health category, there are tons of recommendations, including addressing the problem of higher rates of maternal and infant death experienced by Black women, no matter what your education or income level is. Right? People think that education is going to cure everything. It does not trump, no. Okay, it does not surpass. It does not surpass racism. And so we have recommendations related to, also, there apparently is a formula that I learned about when I was interviewing some folks in medicine to supplement the recommendations. There's this kind of formula that's used, an algorithm is actually what they call it, to determine what you should do with a client, and race is a part of the algorithm. I was just stunned by that. We are trying to get community wellness centers in Black neighborhoods across the state, where Black folk can access mental health support, not just for severe mental health challenges, but prevention and early intervention. And that you can have these services available in your community, but not be forced to use evidence-based practices, which were not designed with an adequate number of people of color included. So we don't have the real evidence that they work, right? Cognitive behavior therapy, everybody loves cognitive behavior therapy. Black folks sometimes, they be like, you want me to do a workbook and do what? Right. But you put, right, but put us in a healing circle and we're ready to go all day long, right? In terms of the Environmental toxins, environmental justice. There are a series of recommendations related to that particular issue. There are recommendations related to, I'm trying to remember all of the chapters now. There's one in particular. It's escaping me. I'm a little sleep deprived. But you can actually have a sneak peek at those recommendations, the draft form. It is a rough cut, but you'll see the range, the scale, the scope of these recommendations. In terms of, there's a chapter focused on incarceration, and there's so much that needs to be done there. You know, one of the things that I'm dealing with on the Civil Brand Commission is discrimination against black folk who are incarcerated. For example, at the women's jail, there's this thing called education-based incarceration. You get to take some classes, get your GED, take some life skills classes, take some, kind of classes that might help prepare you for a job. If you're black, you're less likely to get access to those. And I kept raising this as an issue with the sheriff's department, and they kept saying, oh, no, there's nothing there. No, you're wrong. No, the black people just don't want the classes. And I'm like, you're not going to go down that road, are you? And so what we did was the Board of Supervisors tasked our commission with doing a study of the extent to which people are accessing EBI, education-based incarceration, and what kind of classes they want. Well, we surveyed all of the jails, several hundred, so we randomly sampled, and exactly what we said was happening. If you're black, if you're transgender, you're less likely to get access to EBI programming. But worse than that, if you raise concerns about other things like women who are pregnant not getting enough water, literally, we had to fight to get them 2 bottles of water with each meal. Then you would be retaliated against by the deputies and the custody staff. The women literally have my cell number because the retaliation was getting so bad that they would call me in case they needed me to come in and bring commissioners with me to address the problems. For 2 years, we've been trying to get people investigated, the staff who are causing these problems. So we have a massive number of recommendations related to incarceration, including real programming for reentry, right, which does not really exist at this particular point in time.
I want to bring our faith leaders back in and ask, spiritually, how do you imagine how our state and our world will be transformed if we follow through on these recommendations, if we do this kind of repair together?
I have a saying in church based upon liberation theology. And that saying is basically, there's no point in me telling you about heaven or freedom if you can't afford to pay your rent. Because when you're in the service, you can't focus on the spiritual things if you don't have your basic needs taken care of. And the tragic reality is that for too many black people, they are fighting every day just to survive. That church has become an escape, but it's not a place where you can thrive. Right? And so what was it do for our spirits? I don't quite know because I've never seen it in America. But I imagine that what it would do would give folks the breath, to go deeper in their faith, and not just for how is it going to help me get through the situation, but how does it help me evolve into another place where I don't have to escape this place, but actually live in this place. And I think that's the missing point, right? When you think about theology and what is it meant to do, for many black people, it is a bomb. A bomb from what? From the hell you catching outside. Right. And so the question that I think we really have to ask is, why is it that black people have always been oppressed in this country? Why have reparations not happened? Because I think the country would really have to wrestle with its original sin. I think that it would also have to wrestle with that black people are way more than what you have already prescribed us to be. We are not your appropriate victim, that we have been resilient in spite of the fact. But if you take away the situation, the conditions that have made us have to be so resilient, we may actually be able to go back to the places where we were thriving as merchants and kings and educators and people who were scholars and able to dream impossible dreams. And it wasn't just a rarity, but it's a commonplace.
I should just stop and. So I think that for the Jewish community, for I think white people in general, but in the Jewish tradition, we have an institution called tshuva, which is basically, it's translated as repentance, but it's not only, because it's not only about ritual transgressions, it's not between a person and God, but it's also about interpersonal transgressions. And it's deeply, deeply relational. And the first part of doing tshuva, as the saying goes, getting into this relational space of seeking apology. Here I'll be a professor for a minute. There's a wonderful French philosopher by the name of Emmanuel Levinas, who talks about the fact that I'm trying to explain Levinas in 30 seconds. That's going to be hard. So he talks about his basic notion is that a person's obligation is to the needs of other people. And all one can really do is respond to the face of the other. And he uses the word face because the face is usually the part of a person that's the most vulnerable. It's usually open, unless it's masked, but still open, the eyes, a person. And he says that discourse, conversation, is really important for that. But it's really important to know that you can't control the conversation. And so he says that the archetypal form of discourse is apology. Because in an apology, you are saying something without any hope of a response. So you're opening yourself up to another person, to whatever they want to do. So I think that the way that tshuva can radically transform all of us is that it puts us into a place where we are open to all the things that Pastor Eddie was saying, right? We are open to the fact that, especially in the situation of reparations towards the black community, we are open to the humanity, the spirituality, the deep learning and things that black people have to teach us. And that will change us immeasurably. We will be forced out of our comfort zones. We will be forced out of our silos, right? We won't, oftentimes, even in cities like Los Angeles, perhaps, and especially in cities like Los Angeles, even though they're not legally segregated, even though in places where they're not legally segregated, it's like, nursery school where people do parallel play. Right? We live next to each other and we have lives next to each other, but we don't have lives with each other. And going through a real process of tshuva, of relational engagement and apology, we open ourselves in that to another person's being and allow the other person to control that conversation. And I think that we can't really tell what that will look like on the other side. One thing we can tell is that if we let go in that way, there will be a radical transformation. Because our whole culture is based on control. And if we rather ground it in letting go and embracing others, we don't know what the possibilities of that are.
Can I just say something to, as Aryeh was saying, that I think the greatest fear of folks around reparations from a religious perspective is that it will uncover and unmask that Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and this American exceptionalism are the biggest lies ever told. Right. That it don't actually exist. Right. That it was based upon a system of caste implantation capitalism, which then sold a bad bill of goods and identity theft of religion itself to Black Americans and to the rest of the nation and to anyone else who had color on their skin to make them feel better.
Okay, we're going to open up to audience questions in just 1 minute. Before we do that, I want to ask Dr. Grills what I hope will be 2 shorter questions. One is, what part of the report gets the most pushback from people, and how do you think we can help people understand and build support for this work? And then lastly, will there be a campaign calling for organizations and individuals to talk to their legislators in support of an actual plan of reparations, and when will that happen?
Okay, so on the first part, I can give you a really short answer. What area of the interim report got the most pushback? None of it. None of. We had a team of lawyers working with us, and we crossed every T, dotted every I, found evidence to support everything that we put in there. So the pushback has been, you guys don't deserve that. Or, I wasn't there and my parents weren't there and we didn't enslave anybody, so what are you talking about? But there's no substantive critique of the interim report. If anything, the critique that comes and what the media really plays upon is trying to sensationalize the issue of cash payment. And that's where, and as one gentleman, I've been getting a lot of nasty hate mail. And I noticed when it ticked up was when Fox News put out, did a story on this last week, and all of a sudden my hate mail shot back up. But this one guy was talking about, I wasn't a part of this, and I didn't have anything to do with it, and you guys don't deserve it. I mean, he just went through all of the tropes. At the end of the day, there was no substance there. And when I tried to engage with him, I do try to answer. If they're not calling me out of my name, I will try to engage with you. And my response back was, very humane. And his first line was, "Thank you for having such a civil response." And I was like, well, you're welcome, because you had such an uncivil initial statement. So we're getting a lot of lack of substance kinds of things, knee-jerk reactions. But now in terms of your other question, there's not a strategy in place yet, although we are trying to mobilize community-based organizations to be in the role of shepherding the final report once it gets to the legislature. That's when the real work starts. We cannot let them go behind closed doors and not monitor what they're doing. And we need community-based organizations. We need organizations like yours to take on the responsibility. So right now we've been doing a series, myself and several task force members, series of meetings with foundations to try to show them that they need to get involved with this, because every campaign that they are funding for social justice falls under the umbrella of what we're trying to do in reparations. So it's a win-win for them. So now they're compiling a list. So I would like to include this organization as one of what I call anchor orgs that play a role, because what we need is kind of monitoring what the legislature does. We need to build a strong base of allies, right? Because there's not enough Black folk to win this by ourselves. We didn't get free by ourselves. We didn't do the Underground Railroad by ourselves, and so why would we try to start something like that now? And so one last thing that people can do in the immediate, as we try to get these pieces set up, is we've started a campaign, and three members of the task force, we've been working hard on getting people, organizations rather than individuals, but organizations to endorse either the interim report, the mission of the task force, the idea of reparations. There's about 4 or 5 different ways you can endorse. And we started out with a meager 20 organizations. I think we're about 150 now, but it's not enough. And so if you go to supportreparations.org, you can actually, that website will show you all the list of endorsers, and you can click on their name and you can see their letter. There's a template letter you can use. You can create your own letter. You can adapt an existing letter. The more of those we have, the more we can support, create the idea that there is support for reparations. And by the way, we did do a survey, a poll statewide, random sample. 60% of Californians support the idea of reparations. So we're not as bad as the Pew poll.
So that's something we can all do, is go back to our organizations and find out if they've signed on and if they would consider signing on. And I know that the Black Jewish Justice Alliance has, in fact,
We have signed on.
and endorsed that. Okay, so
Can
I want to...
Before we do, I just want to acknowledge Pastor Smart, who is ably represented by his daughter earlier in this evening. Pastor Smart is, of course, the president and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a co-convener of the Black Jewish Justice Alliance. Also want to acknowledge and give a shout out to Pastor Thomas, Professor Thomas, who is the professor of Pan-African Studies, who is the president of the NAACP of the San Fernando Valley. I got that right? And who is one of the co-sponsors of this evening. So welcome to you. Thank you.
Okay, so we want to take questions from all of you all. I know it's a small room and people might feel like you can just stand up and talk, but I'm going to ask you to use the microphone when it comes around so that both everyone in this room can hear and so that folks who are watching on Zoom can hear. I heard we have over 50 people, I think, watching on Zoom, and I want to make sure they can hear too. So, Susan, are you going to take the mic around, if you would? If you're managing that too, we'll figure it out. But okay, and here's the other thing about questions. We have a way of asking people to ask questions at ICAR, which I'm going to try to apply here, which is this. I learned this from a great rabbi and teacher, and it's this. A question is a sentence that has a question mark at the end of it. So I'm going to ask you to please put all your questions in the form of a question, which again is a sentence that has a question mark at the end of it. Thank you. And just if you raise your hand, then we can know that you have a question.
I'm sorry that I'm late, but I wanted to. This is a question. Of course, one of the things that happened in terms of the NAACP was the NAACP was being said that Amos Brown had said that you remember that whole thing, and so. For those of you who don't know, that he was against cash payments, which was not true at all. They just totally spun that and made it seem as if, and so there was this whole thing about how the NAACP is against cash payments and that kind of thing. And so I actually talked to him. But one of the things that always comes up with when the discussion of reparations is talked about where the money comes from. And, I think that it is incumbent upon those who are proposing reparations to be able to say succinctly where the money comes from. And one of the discussions that I had with Dr. Brown was there's a place that the money can come from. And it can come from, and I want to know if I know I'm totally violating everything that you just said. That's why I didn't even want to.
If you sponsor the event, then you get to violate the rule.
Oh, okay, thank you.
This is going to be the example of what not to do, and then we're going to move on to the next question.
Do not do this.
Okay,
do not do
it.
this.
But finish
the
it off.
reason I say this is it's just very, very, very important. There's a couple of things. The first thing is that Justice John Paul Stevens, who was a Supreme Court justice, who initially was adamantly against affirmative action, gave the most important reason for reparations that I've ever seen. He talks about it, he connects it to the 14th Amendment. George W. Bush, now notice who I'm naming. I'm not naming liberals. George W. Bush, during Katrina, gave the most beautiful statement about the need for reparations. Believe it or not, he did. Citibank, the Citigroup, completed a study that tracked discrimination against black folks from 2000 to 2020, and basically said that discrimination, if this country would stop discriminating against black people in 4 areas: higher education, housing loans, business loans, and income inequity, that they could add every 2 years $2.5 trillion to the GDP, which is almost more than they gave away during the pandemic. And so the point is that discrimination is expensive. And discrimination continues. And so even for those people who would say, I didn't do that, but your system continues to do it. And so I am sending that report to Dr. Brown. It is available. But I think it's very, very important to point out, when we talk about reparations, we're not talking about from money that you have already collected necessarily. We're talking about money that you owe us for continuing to practice white supremacy and discrimination against us. And so that, I think, can change, the way that this is done, because ultimately, we don't want a handout. We want what we have worked for and earned. So I'm sorry.
No, you're okay.
All right, now we're going to try again and see who else has a question.
Hi, my name is Najiba. I was just speaking at University of North Florida, invited by the DEI office, and then went to Nashville and met with the interfaith community there. And I'm sharing these stories with you because when I was in Florida, the students who came to my lecture said, what do I do when the state is against my embodiment? What do I do when the state is against, when my governor is trying to go after my major? And then I went to Nashville right after and met with faith leaders there. So I'm raising these stories because there are places in this country where the conversation is not this. And there are people who, how and what do we learn from this process about the larger conversation around critical race theory, which is a legal theory for those who don't know, and comes out of legal scholarship, and issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are we learning from this process that we can share with others in other states? As someone who's from Los Angeles but travels around the country, I was crying during my lecture because of some of the questions that I got from young people, especially. So and thank you for your bravery and having to, hate mail's not a fun thing to get. It's terrifying. Yeah. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to ask if you have any lessons that you've learned. What was the political will behind this?
So there was, so the whole idea of reparations has a long history in this country. And what we're doing in California is just it's an extension of that long, long history. And so there were folks at the national level and the state level who were keeping an eye on the need for reparations. When George Floyd happened, I think that upped the ante for people in places of power in California, like Shirley Weber, now Secretary Weber, to put forth this idea. And I think we had a moment, because America has ADHD. Yeah. So we had a moment where people not only were aware that we have a problem as a country, but their hearts got touched. And I think that legislation slid through in that moment, you know? And so we have to watch for the moments. Unfortunately, the moments, it's kind of like a Jesus story, requires a sacrifice of someone. This is the first time, you all, the first group I've ever said that to. It's been in my head and on my heart, but you know, I think that's true. So, yeah, and so one of the things that I've learned is that this is not an intellectual exercise. We've got to be able to get to people's hearts, we've got to touch their spirit, we've got to connect with their soul. And that's not easy to do, but it can happen in small group settings, in people, in meetings like this, in people's homes. That we need to form study groups. We're developing a curriculum around the interim report. We need to take that show on the road. And I think also we need to realize that even if we get the federal reparations going, we still need to stay local, because every community has a story yet to be told. Who is it? Zora Neale Hurston said, there's no agony like bearing a story inside of you that is, not allowed to see the light of day, right? And so I think that we need people to feel it, and we need to find a way to connect, which is why I keep responding to these horrible emails. It's like, what is it that I can say that might move the needle just a little bit so that we can actually have a dialogue, right? Because up to that point, there's no dialogue.
I'm going to share a question from Zoom real quick. For Rabbi Cohen, how do we mobilize more non-Black Jew communities to take greater action? What does Jewish allyship towards reparations look like?
That's a great question. I think that we mobilize it in this way, as Dr. Grill said. We meet, we talk, we study. There are study sheets. There are people who have written about this. But also, we have to be in rooms which are not just Jewish rooms. We have to be in rooms which are Jewish and African American and so we have to talk to each other and find out and hear each other and listen to each other. I think that allyship on this means following what the impacted communities are saying. It's listening to, as Pastor Thomas said, listening to the fact that the reparations are not a handout, but are payment for labor stolen. Listening to what Dr. Grill said about the ongoing impacts of enslavement in terms of healthcare, in terms of environmental justice. Listening to what other people are saying, and then building from there and talking to each other. And I think Jews have to challenge each other. I think we have to push each other out of our comfort zones and say to each other, how are you taking responsibility for the fact that we're living in this city rather than living in a small neighborhood or living in a community? We're living in a larger city, and in that city we have responsibility for lots of things that are going on in that city, like everybody else does.
Hi, I'm Sam, and I want to thank you, Dr. Grills. I learned so much, and thank you, Pastor Eddie and Rabbi Cohen. It's 4 questions built into one, and they all end with a question mark. And first, I just want to speak to what you said. I also want to acknowledge that it's Jewish rooms, African American rooms, and then there's a whole room of Jews of color that's traveling between all those rooms. I don't think it's an or, and I just wanted to say that. But I also, are there places or governments or times in history that have done reparations well that we can look at to learn from, to use techniques that were either successful or not to appeal to people now? That's one question. And you can just take any of these if you want. And the other question is, how does intergenerational trauma, genetically transmitted, play into a compelling argument for people who are sort of like, get over it, we're here now, that was then. I know for Jewish victims of the Holocaust, intergenerational trauma was a big piece of the legal argument that kind of put things over the line for a lot of judges. And then I guess the last question is, and I think it's what you were saying, Dr. Grills, but how do you get people to just, that thing of, oh, like my answer, we didn't do anything, but like, that's what a society is. Like, I don't run through every red light, but I still pay taxes that repair the red lights. Like, I pay into public school, like library. Like, so why do people even get to use that argument? So those are my 3 questions. Thank you.
I'll start with the last one first. I think at the end of the day, people are making up excuses and arguments to cover up what is really driving it's almost like a hateful, it's not like I just don't like it, it's this venom that goes with it. Oh no. And right. Sorry. And so what ends up happening for me is I said, well, what's behind that? I'm peeling back the layers of the onion. I think what's at the heart of it is an anti-Black attitude and ethos that is, frankly, potentially baked into the DNA of some folks who, generation after generation, this kind of narrative and attitude and mindset was passed down over and over and over again. And so we have to deal with, where did that come from? Who taught you to hate us? Right, so much, and what does that do for you to have that kind of attitude towards us? And I think it does do something for folks. Yeah, right. And then in terms of the other question about, I had it in my head. Oh, the generational trauma, yes. So you're right, that research, Yehuda, was really instrumental, and put epigenetics on the map for people. The challenge is that my colleagues in science will say, I think Yehuda was able to make the argument and people didn't question the science that much. But today, people argue, well, a lot of that epigenetics research is based on animal analogs. It hasn't been fully verified with human beings. I think we're getting closer, but I think they will try to use that argument to dilute the import of that. But I believe that we definitely are dealing with some generational trauma and stress that is passed down. And if I look at the most recent research that came out of UCLA, I attended the 3 researchers presenting on this. They were able to document 5 generations of passing on learning of a habit in response to a stressor, right? So it's just a matter of time, but I think there is a compelling argument to make there. But short of that, we can then just look to the existing data about the extent of mental health and health problems and the shortened lifespan for African Americans. And many of the things that are killing us are preventable, but they're very, very much aligned with stress. And for Black folk in this country, because of racism, when you think about stress response, for us, so when you get, if Predator came in this room right now from that movie, right? If he came in the room right now, what would we all do? We would jump up and run out, right? The other door, right? That's the fight or flight response. Imagine that nothing is coming in the room, but all the Black folk get up and start running out the door. And you say, but where's the threat? We are living with the anticipation of the threat all the time, day in and day out. We do have research that says that takes a toll on your body and that takes a toll on your mind. And, there's the weathering hypothesis, there's the shortening of telomeres and all of those other kinds of things. So I think we can bring that argument in as well.
We're going to take 2 more questions.
For your question around, has it been implemented? Skokie has done it in Chicago. They've given reparations.
Yeah.
Hi. It's kind of an offshoot of that third question, actually. But the question was, how do you? A lot of people, white people in particular, have very defensive, immediate, visceral reactions to the mere mention of the word reparations. How, any of you could answer this question, please. How do you stop, or how do you get past those defenses? What are the arguments you use? What is the best way to get people to open up to the idea that this is a good idea?
I have a theory, but it's just a theory. So, you know how we talk about multi-generational stress and the epigenetics, and we pass things on to the present generations? What if that also works for white folks? And there is the stress of knowing what happened. There is the stress associated with being afraid that what you did, not you personally, but the group did to black folks, if given the chance to be fully free, would black folks do that back, right? And then there's the built-in fear associated with what were constant and regular uprisings on the plantations that we're never taught about. But there were quite a few. We never did get comfortable with enslavement. We never accepted it, and we fought it constantly. So for the slave owners and the slave catchers and everybody that was benefiting, daily life was like looking, is anybody plotting and planning anything now? Is somebody going to put, crushed up glass in my food? Are they going to burn down the house? So I think that there may, in fact, be a fear factor. So for me, the answer is not coming up with the right argument, but getting people, white people, into spaces with other white people to start healing around this issue. And I'm actually about to put together a document to go to the American Psychological Association to say to them, you are derelict on your duty. And you're derelict in this sense. Show me a definition, a diagnosis for racism. It is a disease. It requires you to distort reality. And it diminishes and can dilute your own sense of compassion and humanity. And so that needs to be addressed. But we have never seen anything remotely touching on that in by the American Psychiatric or the American Psychological Association. And just like we in the Association of Black Psychologists have launched for the last 7-8 years these emotional emancipation healing circles to help us unload all the trauma and the stress and live a life undefined by racism, we need white folks to have those kinds of healing circles. But I can't do it with a white person, right? It needs to be kind of like within the family, if you will. Have that conversation, and if each family is having those conversations, when I'm saying family, I'm talking about cultural, ethnic groups, then we can come together and have real conversations that are going to change the culture of not just issues around racism, but the culture of this society, which is overly individualistic, which then breeds this idea, well, I didn't do it. Well, of course you didn't do it, but you benefit, or you collude with, or you turn a blind eye, but we are each other's keepers. We are each other's medicine. And we have an obligation to do that because we are wired, literally neurologically, to be connected to each other.
That's I think, very powerful and important. I would add one thing. I think there are two possible ways to talk to somebody who's being really defensive. One is shock and awe, which is just reframing what they think they know about American history, about their place in society. What does democracy mean? Has America ever been a democratic society? That works in some people. Other people will just completely turn them off and they'll walk out of the room and send you death threats. But the other way is to go for most people want to think of themselves as righteous, right? And so to attach yourself to that part in a person. I know you want to be a good person, right? What does it mean to be a good person, right? You feel pain. You feel pain when other people are hurt. And go into that place and from there work out to how would you feel if you were responsible for other people's pain? What would you do to undo that? And, I know this has worked in labor situations. You speak to managers of car washes or managers of hotels and who want to, or even, I've been in situations with the head of ICE where they're religious people and they want to see themselves as righteous. And so you speak to their righteousness. You bridge that gap, trying to walk along their righteousness and try to get them to turn their righteousness towards, outside of themselves and towards rethinking their understanding of race and what this country is built on. Doesn't always work, but it's worth a try. Yeah.
So we're going to take one last question.
Thank each of you so much for your presentation and your passion. It is medicine to the soul to hear truth being spoken to our ancestors who stand among us. And I know that they want us to be blessed. What would reparations look like to a 3-year-old? The studies show that from 3 to 3rd grade, Black children are already being marked for the penal system. Whether they will succeed, whether they will be incarcerated, or whether they will be caught up in some construct the rest of their life. What would that reparations look like for a 3rd grader who does not get called on by the teacher? What would reparations look like to a family who is constantly worried about what school that their Black child would go to? We've been through that, and people have responded to us, y'all still haven't figured that out yet? No, because the problem hasn't been solved. We've asked around when our children were little, do you know how to get in this school or that school, not being from here? And what comes easy for other cultures, other people, white people, is so very hard for us to melt into the melting pot. It's like that product you use in gumbo that doesn't quite melt away, and you spend all day trying to mesh it up, and it's still floating in the gumbo. That's us. We can't quite break up and melt into the melting pot because our questions are never answered. Our questions are misconstrued. Sometimes I would just like to be accepted and us to be able to speak on whatever we need to say. Maybe it's in the form of a question and maybe it's not. But we truly will understand what the Black folk are saying. I got you. What would reparations look like for Black women who have markers, genetic markers on their womb, their uterus, their reproductive organs, from years of massa taking advantage of their womb, producing child after child without permission? What would that look like not to have an early hysterectomy? What would that look like to be able to go into Kaiser and not die on the birthing table? What would it look like not to have extra cramps from the PMS that was given to my grandmother some 100 years ago? What would it look like to just be and operate in the American system without the woes of hatred and the woes of racism? And you spoke a word about the face being revealing. See, oftentimes the difference in the Jewish experience and the Black experience is when people see you, they see white. And so you can't hide being white. We can't hide being Black. And so we have to just be accepted as being Black. Deal with it. It's a Black issue, and you have to walk through that Blackness. I don't care what your title is. You're going to have to walk through the process of finding a solution for your 3rd grade child so that they do not. That's the top worry. I don't want my child to be in the penal system, not what progressive club or camp my child will go to this summer. Other folk get that opportunity to send their children to a camp in the summer. We have to worry if our child is safe in the school system, safe on the streets. And when they get older, God forbid you hear a police car go screeching down the street. You're thinking, where's my child? Are you in? Are you back there in your bedroom? We have questions that we have not gotten answers for since the day we stepped off of those boats. Question after question after question. So questions come easy for us. It's the answers that we need. Reparations. Dr. Grills, with your research, and this I feel to my soul, what would it look like for our children in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade to have a reparations foundation, something to pull from and say, you can go study engineering, you can go to a camp this year, you can go to a wellness retreat. Forget ADHD medicine, you will go to a sound spa for the summer. Hallelujah. Right. Jubilee.
Fully funded historically Black college.
Oh, yes. This is the walking HBC. What would that look like?
I'm going to give you a very short, but I think speaks volumes answer, and it's a two-part. First, what would happen is that as the doctor, I'm blocking on his name now, he developed choice theory and reality therapy. He said that, a healthy community is one where, thank you, I forgot. A healthy community is one where if a single child is struggling, the entire community calls an emergency alarm and we rally around that child, right? And so that would be the situation. It doesn't matter what your race is. It does not matter what your income level is. It does not matter what zip code you live in. If a single child is struggling, it matters to all of us, and we kick into gear to address it. The other part of it is, our child, and you nailed it when you started talking about kindergarten and up to 3rd grade. I've done these emotional emancipation circle workshops and healing experientials across the U.S., throughout the Caribbean, even into the UK, South America, et cetera. Black folks' reaction, no matter where in the world I go and do this, is almost identical. It's like fish taking to water. What we found and what we hear in those circles, and when we ask people, there's a little activity that asks people to, remember, when's the first time you realized you were Black? And typically, the response is when they were in 1st grade, kindergarten, 2nd grade, right? And when they start telling that story, it's as though it just happened. The feelings are raw. And I cannot tell, from young people, 20 years old to folks in their 80s. But what then would look different is that 3rd grader, that kindergartner, when they are in their last moments on this earth, will not have to do what, in fact, a social worker shared with me who does hospice work, and primarily with Black and brown folks. She said, I cannot tell you how many times in their last moments in hospice, Black patients started talking about all of the racism that they've had stuffed inside of them, and they're trying, it makes me want to cry. They started letting it go. They're like, I can't carry this anymore. I'm not taking this burden with me to my grave. So our children would not have to take that burden to their grave.
I can't really imagine any more powerful way to end this conversation. Thank you for bringing that question. Thank you for asking for a vision of what will reparations look like for the child and for the person at the very end of life. That is what we are trying to build, I hope, together, is a society of love and justice, of care deeply for one another, in which we can all be truly free because our liberation is bound up with one another. So thank you for bringing bringing all of your work to this conversation. Thank you, Rabbi Cohen and Pastor Eddie, for helping us to think about how we as a community of faith can come together to do this work together for reparations. And I just want to remind folks that Dr. Grills has said to us that there will be opportunities for us to actually take action and support this effort coming in the summer. So we will be sharing those through our various organizations. And then just lastly, to thank you all for being here. We really appreciate the audience and all of you for participating.
I want to thank everyone for coming together. And I want to thank, first of all, Aryeh and Cohen, for Dr. Rabbi for putting this, for having the impetus to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. I want to thank Dr. Grills for accepting the time to come together to do this. And Brother Eddie, I want to thank you for stepping in for Njuma, who was down where I was, and forgive me, but I hear that my daughter really did it, so I don't have to worry about me. And there's a lot of politics around this movement with the group that they're working with, the coalition, the state commission. And I just want to say SCLC is 100% supportive of Dr. Grills, okay? Yeah. We will stand behind her. We will do whatever she says we need to do. And I hope everyone will understand that it's really important for her to really be one of the leaders, and others people are on the panel also, but she is the one with the historical background and knowledge of what has happened to us and why this movement at this time is so crucial to us. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here.